There is a mystery in prayer that the human mind cannot capture by logic, for true prayer is not the act of speaking words or asking favors from a distant deity. It is the sacred communion between the soul and the infinite presence that already knows our need before we can form it into thought. Many prayers fail, not because the divine has withheld an answer, but because the mind has mistaken desire for prayer and fear for faith. When one prays merely to change outer conditions, the prayer is bound to the world of effect. But when one turns inward in stillness, seeking only the realization of God's presence, the outer world reshapes itself in quiet obedience to that inner knowing. The real work of prayer begins when words fall away. Silence becomes the language of spirit. In that silence there is no asking, no pleading, only the awareness that all is already complete within the infinite wholeness of being. To pray rightly is to rest in that awareness until the sense of separation dissolves and the self that prays merges with the presence that answers. Then prayer ceases to be something we do. It becomes the state of consciousness we live in. When one prays with anxious hope, the vibration of fear goes forth and returns in its likeness. When one prays in still assurance, knowing the truth of divine harmony, the same law operates. What is held in consciousness becomes experience. The universe does not respond to the words of the prayer, but to the consciousness behind it. Therefore, it is not more prayer that is needed, but deeper prayer. A prayer, without motive, without demand, without the noise of the personal will. Each time you go within and touch the quiet center of being, something invisible is set in motion. You may not see the result in that instant, but the peace you feel is the beginning of the answer itself. Let your prayer be not for things or outcomes, but for the realization of the one life that lives itself through you. When that life is felt, the outer world aligns without struggle. For prayer is not to change God's mind, but to awaken our own. In the stillness where all desire ceases, the answer is already present. For in that moment you discover, you were never praying to be answered. You were praying to remember who you are. True prayer is communion, not petition. Real prayer is not about asking or begging for things, but entering a deep inner connection with the infinite presence that already knows our needs. The power of prayer lies in consciousness, not words. The universe does not respond to spoken words, but to the vibration and awareness behind them. Our inner state determines the outcome, not our outer requests. Silence is the language of the spirit. When words and desires fall away, the soul meets the divine in stillness. In that silence, all answers are already present. Fearful or anxious prayers cannot bring peace. When prayer is driven by worry or desperation, it creates more of the same energy. Only calm, assured awareness of divine harmony allows true transformation. Prayer awakens us to our oneness with God. The purpose of prayer is not to change circumstances or persuade God, but to awaken to our unity with the infinite, realizing that we and the divine are not separate. True prayer is not a request sent out into the heavens hoping for an answer from afar. It is a deep communion, an intimate meeting between the soul and the infinite presence that sustains all life. Most people approach prayer as though God was somewhere outside of themselves, distant and withholding, waiting to be persuaded by the right words or the right attitude. But prayer in its truest form is not an act of convincing or pleading. It is an act of remembering. It is remembering that the very presence to whom we pray already lies within us, closer than breath, nearer than thought. When the heart begins to sense this, prayer transforms from an effort to a resting. The mind no longer tries to direct the infinite or to shape events according to personal desire. Instead, one grows still, allowing the awareness of divine companionship to fill the silence. In that sacred quiet, words become unnecessary. The soul communes in ways that thought cannot describe, and the presence responds not through external signs, but through an inner assurance that all is well, that harmony reigns even when appearances suggest otherwise. Every great mystic who has touched the heart of truth has spoken of this inner stillness. They have said that when a person ceases to pray for things and begins to dwell in the realization of God's presence, life itself becomes prayer. The division between the one who prays and the one prayed to disappears. There is only the awareness of oneness, and in that awareness lies peace. The outer world may still contain its challenges, Yet the soul that knows its source no longer fears the storm. Snorts, it rests in the calm that no circumstance can disturb. When we approach prayer as a transaction, asking for health, for wealth, for relief, we confine the infinite to the limits of human desire. We say, in effect, "I know what should happen now, make it so." Such prayer can never be truly answered, for it is born of separation and self-will. But when we release the desire to control outcomes and instead seek only to feel the presence within, the power of divine harmony begins to flow freely through every part of life. That flow itself becomes the answer. It is not that God refuses to answer our petitions. Rather, our petitions obscure the very presence that is the answer. Imagine standing in bright sunlight while keeping your eyes closed and asking for light. The light is already there, waiting for your awareness to open. Prayer in its purest form is this: opening of the inner eye. It is not reaching outward. It is turning inward until the light is seen and felt in the silence of the heart. This communion is not achieved through effort, but through surrender. It is the quiet yielding of the personal will to the divine will, which is not separate, but one and the same. In that surrender, fear dissolves, striving ceases, and the soul rests in the rhythm of the infinite. And in that rest, something miraculous happens. The outer life begins to mirror the inner peace. Circumstances align, needs are met, relationships are healed, not because we demanded it, but because harmony naturally expresses itself where resistance has ceased. True prayer requires no formality, no ritual, no specific posture. It can happen in a silent room, in the midst of work, or in the stillness of night. What matters is the quality of awareness. One may say 1,000 prayers and yet never truly pray if the heart remains centered in fear or desire, but a single moment of quiet communion where all thought falls away and only the presence remains accomplishes what words could never achieve. In this understanding, prayer is not something we do from time to time. It becomes the very atmosphere we live in. Every breath, every heartbeat, every act of kindness becomes an expression of communion. The line between prayer and life dissolves, for to live in constant remembrance of the presence is to live in perpetual prayer. It is to walk through the world with an awareness that all things, all moments, all beings are enfolded in divine love. Thus the essence of true prayer is not in asking for anything, but in realizing that nothing is lacking. When the soul is attuned to the infinite, even the simplest moment becomes sacred. The sun rises, a child laughs, a breeze touches the face, and in all these one feels the whisper of the eternal saying, "I am here." That awareness, that still wordless knowing, is the highest form of prayer. The power of prayer lies not in the words we speak, but in the consciousness from which those words arise. Every prayer carries the vibration of the heart that utters it, and it is this vibration that touches the unseen law of life. Words are only symbols, they have no creative power of their own. It is the awareness, the state of being behind them, that determines their effect. When the consciousness is filled with doubt, fear, or separation, even the most eloquent prayer becomes an empty sound. But when the consciousness is alive with faith, peace, and the realization of divine unity, a whisper or even a silent thought can move mountains. Many people imagine that prayer works because of repetition or emotional intensity. They believe that if they say the right words often enough or with enough passion, something outside of them will hear and respond. But this misunderstanding keeps them bound to the outer form while missing the inner essence. The infinite does not respond to volume or repetition. It responds to awareness. The moment a soul awakens to its oneness with divine life, that awareness itself becomes the prayer. The power flows not because we have spoken, but because we have remembered. The mind, in its ignorance, thinks that words are the force that moves the universe. Yet all creation responds not to words but to consciousness. The tree grows, the sun rises, the ocean moves, all in obedience to the unseen order of divine intelligence. When the human heart aligns itself with that same intelligence, life begins to unfold effortlessly, harmoniously, and prayer becomes a channel for that divine movement. It is not a demand upon the universe but a recognition of its perfection. The right, Prayer, therefore, is not change this or give me that, but let me see as truth sees. Let me know as love knows. To pray from consciousness means to recognize that God is not a force we summon. God is the very life that animates us. The consciousness of separation, believing that we are small beings appealing to a distant power, creates its own barrier to fulfillment. But when we shift from asking to realizing, when we pray from the knowing that divine wholeness is already present, the prayer becomes creative. It is the difference between seeking light and standing in it. Every thought and emotion carries a spiritual frequency. When we pray in fear, the energy we release attracts its likeness, for fear cannot create peace. When we pray in calm assurance, holding the awareness of divine order, we draw forth that same order into our experience. It is not magic. It is the natural law of consciousness reflecting itself in form. The outer life is but a mirror of the inner state. Therefore, to change what appears outside, one must first transform the consciousness within. When one understands this, prayer ceases to be an act of asking and becomes a discipline of awareness. It becomes the art of lifting thought above appearances into the realm of truth. The moment the heart rises into the consciousness of God's presence, the discord of the outer world begins to fade. Not because conditions are forced to change, but because one no longer perceives them through the lens of separation. The divine harmony that was always present is revealed. The words of a prayer, then, are like the notes of a song. They are useful only when they arise from the melody of the soul. If the heart is empty, the notes are lifeless. But when the heart is full of truth, even silence becomes a hymn. It is not the language of the prayer that matters, but the consciousness that sings through it. A simple thank you uttered from the depth of realization carries more power than hours of spoken petition born of anxiety. In spiritual understanding, this principle becomes clear. The universe is consciousness, and consciousness is creative. Whatever you hold as real within your awareness eventually manifests as form. If you hold separation, you experience lack. If you hold unity, you experience abundance. If you hold fear, you attract conflict. If you hold love, you live in peace. Prayer, therefore, is the deliberate elevation of consciousness into harmony with divine truth. It is the practice of aligning the inner world so that the outer world may reflect that alignment. Those who have discovered the secret of inner communion no longer measure their prayers by results but by awareness. They know that the true effect of prayer is not the changing of conditions, but the deepening of realization. When consciousness is illumined, conditions naturally adjust to that light. This is why two people may pray for the same thing and one finds peace while the other finds frustration. The difference lies not in the prayer itself, but in the consciousness behind it. Thus, every genuine prayer begins in silence. Before any word is spoken, the soul must enter the stillness where the divine presence is felt. From that stillness, words may or may not emerge, but the true communication has already occurred. For in that quiet awareness, consciousness and the infinite are one, and in that union, the creative power of life flows unhindered. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of something far, greater than words can express. It is the sacred space where the noise of the mind fades and the soul begins to hear the whisper of the infinite. In silence, prayer takes its true form, not as speech, not as thought, but as awareness. The Spirit speaks a language that cannot be spoken. It communicates through stillness, through the subtle vibration of peace that moves through the heart when all outer striving ceases. When the mind is silent, the presence that has always been there is revealed. And in that revelation, prayer is fulfilled before it is ever spoken. The human mind, restless and eager to be heard, fills its prayers with many words, thinking that the divine can be persuaded by repetition or emotion. Yet the infinite needs no convincing. The universe does not respond to pleading. It responds to being recognized. Silence is that recognition. In silence, we are no longer trying to reach God. We are resting in God. The very stillness becomes the prayer, the communion, and the answer all at once. There is no asking, no expecting, no effort. There is only the realization that all is already complete within the vastness of divine order. When one first begins to enter silence, the mind resists. It seeks distraction. It judges. It fears the emptiness. But beneath that apparent emptiness lies a living presence, gentle and eternal, waiting to be known. The silence of prayer is not dull or lifeless. It is radiant, alive with the pulse of creation. In that silence, one begins to feel the flow of divine intelligence that animates all things. The heart becomes aware of an invisible rhythm guiding every breath, every heartbeat, every movement of life. This is the language of the Spirit, and it speaks not to the ears but to the soul. In the outer world, silence is often seen as inaction, but in the inner world, it is the highest form of activity. In silence, divine law is at work, restoring balance, dissolving fear, healing confusion, and aligning thought with truth. When we pray in silence, we withdraw from the chaos of appearances and rest in the awareness that harmony already is. We stop struggling to fix the world and instead awakened to the realization that the world seen through divine consciousness needs no fixing. It is our perception that must be healed, and silence is the doorway through which that healing comes. There is immense power in the moment when one stops speaking and begins listening, not listening for a voice, not waiting for a sign, but simply being still. The listening itself becomes the prayer. It is in this listening that the presence reveals itself, not as a thought, not as an image, but as a deep inner knowing. In that knowing, fear dissolves. The sense of separation that once drove us to seek help from outside vanishes. The soul recognizes that it was never apart from its source. That recognition is the essence of spiritual realization, and it comes only in silence. When prayer rises from silence, it carries the fragrance of peace, words spoken after the heart has entered. The quiet are not ordinary words. They are charged with the energy of divine consciousness. They do not plead or demand. They affirm truth. They are not sent outward but flow from the inner stillness that already knows. Such prayer may appear simple, perhaps just a soft thank you or even no word at all. But it carries a depth that transforms everything it touches. In silence, the mind surrenders its need to understand and control. It ceases its endless questioning and begins to trust. The moment trust awakens, a profound stillness descends, and that stillness is filled with light. One becomes aware that every answer already exists within that light. The more we abide there, the more clearly we see that prayer was never about changing reality. It was about awakening to it. The silence of prayer is the unveiling of truth, not the creation of it. As the habit of inner silence grows, life itself begins to reflect that peace. Situations that once disturbed no longer have power. People who once seemed difficult are now seen through the eyes of compassion. The outer world softens because the inner world has found its still point. This is not passivity, it is mastery. For when one is rooted in the silence of spirit, every action, every word becomes guided by divine intelligence. There is no waste, no struggle, only flow. Thus, silence becomes the purest form of worship. It is not something one does for a few minutes each day, but a state of being that permeates life. One learns to walk in silence, to think from silence, to love through silence. In that sacred quiet, all division fades and the truth of unness is revealed. Not as a concept, but as living experience. Silence is the language through which God speaks to the soul. And when the soul learns to listen, nothing more needs to be said. When a person prays with fear or desperation, the vibration that goes forth from the heart carries the very energy of that fear. It may sound holy, it may use sacred words, but beneath the surface lies anxiety, uncertainty, and doubt. The universe does not answer the words, it mirrors the consciousness that sends them. A fearful prayer, no matter how earnestly spoken, calls forth more fear because consciousness always reproduces after its kind. Just as a seed can only bring forth fruit of its own nature, a prayer rooted in worry can only yield results that match that worry. This is why so many prayers seem unanswered. They were not prayers of faith, but of fear disguised as devotion. True prayer begins when the heart is quiet, when the restless mind no longer reaches outward for rescue, but inward for remembrance. It begins when one ceases to plead for change and instead allows divine peace to enter awareness. That peace is not the result of prayer. It is the very substance of it. When you are still enough to feel that calm assurance that all is well even before circumstances confirm it, then prayer has already fulfilled its purpose. For the goal of prayer is not to make something happen. It is to bring you into alignment with the reality that divine harmony is already happening. Fearful prayers fail because they deny this truth. They affirm lack, danger, and separation. They say, "I am in need, and something must be fixed." In that consciousness, one has already stepped out of the divine flow. But when the heart prays in peace, when it rests in the awareness that divine intelligence governs all, then the energy of that prayer harmonizes with the infinite order of life. There is no strain, no pleading, no struggle. The consciousness itself becomes creative because it is reflecting the peace and power of the infinite. Prayer is like tuning an instrument. If the string is too tight with fear, it cannot make music. If it is too loose with indifference, it cannot sound clear. Only when the tension of human will is released and the tone of divine trust is found, does the melody of prayer sing through the soul. When one reaches that inner harmony, words are no longer necessary. The prayer continues in silence as a radiant awareness of love. That love is the power that heals, provides, and restores, not because it is summoned, but because it is the natural expression of divine consciousness through a peaceful heart. Many pray as if to convince God to act, to intervene, to change the course of events. But the divine is already acting, already present, already perfect. It is not God who must change. It is our awareness that must awaken. The moment the inner world is stilled and the heart rests in assurance, the outer world reflects that peace. Circumstances begin to shift, not because they were forced to, but because the vibration of harmony dissolves the illusions of discord. Fearful thoughts lose their hold, and love takes their place. It is not easy for the human mind to pray in peace, because it has been trained to believe that anxiety proves sincerity. People often think they must struggle, weep, or plead to be heard, but the spirit does not hear emotion. It hears consciousness. The calm, steady awareness of divine order speaks louder than the loudest cry. To pray rightly is not to beg for change, but to abide in the still, knowing that divine order is unbroken. In that state, one becomes a channel through which peace flows outward into every condition. When you pray in peace, you are no longer trying to change reality. You are seeing reality rightly. You are acknowledging that beneath every appearance of chaos lies the perfect rhythm of divine intelligence. You are trusting that what you cannot yet see with the eyes will soon be revealed through faith. That faith is not blind, it is the direct perception of truth beyond appearances. It is the knowing that even when the storm rages, there is an unmovable center of calm within, and from that calm all answers come. Fearful prayer says, "Something is wrong." Peaceful prayer says, "All is well." The difference is not in the words, but in the vibration of consciousness behind them. When one prays with the latter awareness, healing begins instantly, not because the situation changes, but because the perception changes. And in spiritual law, as perception changes, so does the experience. The peace within draws forth peace without, for outer life is always the mirror of inner awareness. To pray with peaceful assurance is to live in faith. It is to know that divine intelligence cannot fail, that love never leaves, and that harmony is the nature of all creation. When you rest in that understanding, your prayer becomes effortless. You cease trying to make things happen and instead let things unfold. In that surrender, power flows. Not the power of human will, but the silent, boundless power of divine grace. That is why the prayers of the peaceful heart always work, while the prayers of the fearful heart return unanswered. The purpose of prayer is not to persuade God or to bend divine will toward our personal desires. The true purpose of prayer is awakening, the realization of our oneness with the infinite life that is already expressing itself through us. Most people pray as though there were two beings, a needy human and a distant deity who must be convinced to act. But the essence of spiritual understanding reveals that there is no such separation. The one who prays and the presence to whom the prayer is directed are one and the same. The very act of turning inward is not to reach God, but to remember that we never left. When we come to this awareness, Prayer ceases to be an act of seeking and becomes an experience of being. It is no longer an effort to draw something to us, but a quiet resting in the truth that all good already is. This awakening cannot be forced by words or ritual. It happens in stillness, in surrender, in the quiet knowing that divine life is living itself as us. As the wave is not apart from the ocean, so are we not apart from the infinite source. The moment the mind stops identifying itself as a separate self struggling in time and space, the reality of unity dawns. That realization is the highest prayer for it, is the direct experience of truth. When one prays from a sense of separation, every word, though sincere, carries within it the vibration of distance and lack. But when prayer arises from oneness, it carries the power of fulfillment, because it is spoken from consciousness of wholeness. The universe cannot withhold itself from what it already is. The more we awaken to our unity with divine life, the less we find ourselves asking for things. We begin instead to rest in gratitude, in awe of the completeness that has always been. Prayer becomes not a reaching toward God, but an allowing of God to express through us, an open channel through which love, wisdom, and peace flow without obstruction. This awakening changes everything. It transforms the way we see ourselves, others, and the world. We begin to recognize that there are no separate lives, no isolated souls, struggling for favor. All are expressions of the same divine being, each wave carrying the rhythm of the same ocean. To pray for another, then, is not to send help from afar, but to recognize the same divine life operating within them as within ourselves. In that recognition, healing takes place not because we did something, but because we saw truly. Seeing rightly is healing. When the soul awakens to its oneness with God, fear loses its foundation. There is no longer the belief that life can harm, that supply can vanish, that love can be withdrawn. These are illusions born of separation. In unity, all such illusions dissolve. We realize that everything we sought through prayer, peace, healing, supply, understanding was never missing. It was only hidden behind the veil of mistaken identity. As that veil lifts, the fullness of divine life shines forth and prayer becomes gratitude. The heart no longer asks, it simply says, "Thank you." And that gratitude opens wider the channel of grace. This state of prayer is not reserved for saints or mystics. It is the birthright of every soul. It requires only a willingness to be still and to see beyond the surface of things. When we enter that stillness and feel the presence within, even for a moment, something changes at the root of being. We sense that we are not praying to reach something higher. We are the very expression of that higher life. The infinite is breathing through us, thinking through us, living through us. To live from that awareness is to pray without ceasing. Every breath, every act, every thought becomes a movement of divine expression. In this understanding, prayer and life become one. We no longer divide the sacred and the ordinary, the spiritual and the material. All is holy because all is God appearing. Washing dishes, walking through a crowd, sitting in silence. All can be prayer when done in the awareness of oneness. Every moment becomes a revelation of divine life unfolding as this very experience. Nothing needs to be added, nothing needs to be removed. The prayer of awakening is simply to see this truth more clearly. When one truly knows this unity, there is no more fear of unanswered prayer, for there is no longer the sense of waiting for results. The answer has already been given, for it's contained within the awareness itself. In awakening to oneness, we discover that prayer was never about getting, but about realizing. What we sought was not a thing but an understanding. We do not change God through prayer. We allow prayer to change our vision until we see as God sees. And in that vision there is only love, only peace, only the eternal now, where all things are complete. And so the mystery of prayer is not in the asking, but in the awakening. When we come to that sacred stillness where the mind surrenders and the heart listens, we discover that there was never a distance between ourselves and the divine. Every answered prayer, every moment of grace, every glimpse of peace has come not from pleading but from realizing the presence that has always been here. To pray, then, is not to reach for God. It is to open our eyes to the God that is living, breathing and moving within us. Now let every prayer become a quiet remembrance of that truth. Let every silence reveal the fullness already given. For when the soul knows its unity with the infinite, it needs no words, no proof, no sign. It simply rests in the eternal assurance that all is well, all is whole, and all is.